The army's greatest weakness was the land itself. An entire column of soldiers could march for weeks and never find a single warrior. The prairie was a fortress for the tribes who knew its secrets. To overcome this, the military relied on scouts who thought like their enemy. These men could read a broken branch or a faint track, turning the empty wilderness into a map that led directly to their target. The year was 1837. Martin Van Buren occupied the White House while the nation's attention drifted west. The Santa Fe Trail was a dusty artery of commerce, its ruts carved deep by the wheels of traders' wagons pushing toward New Mexico. To the north, the newer Oregon Trail carried the first hardy waves of settlers and missionaries into the vast, unclaimed country. It was an era of expansion, of a belief in a destiny that was manifest, pulling the young country across the continent. But this westward push was not into an empty land. By federal decree, Native American tribes from the east had been forced from their ancestral homes, relocated into a newly designated Indian Territory. This territory was already occupied, home to a flourishing and powerful Plains Indian culture, setting the stage for a collision of worlds. Into this tense landscape rode the United States Dragoons. Organized in 1833, they were the elite troopers of the Frontier Army, the forerunners of America's celebrated cavalry. Their job was to police the Western Plains, a mission given to them by men like Stephen Watts Kearny, the father of the U.S. cavalry, who wrote the very manual on their maneuvers. These were soldiers on horseback, trained for a new kind of warfare. Their weapons were formidable and brutal. They carried a Prussian-style saber, an unwieldy blade, so heavy it earned the name Old Wristbreaker. For firepower, they relied on a muzzle-loading .52 caliber rifle and a .54 caliber pistol, both capable of blowing a hole in a man the size of a melon. For greater effect, they could deploy powerful mountain howitzers, light artillery that could be disassembled and carried by mules. Their appearance was designed to impress and intimidate. The dragoons dressed in flashy, striking uniforms of dark blue with bright yellow piping. In 1851, the trim color was changed to a vibrant orange, a deliberate choice meant to command the attention of the colorfully painted warriors of the plains. But on this raw frontier, there were no buildings to house these troops. The army's first task was to build its own shelter. A series of forts was constructed, running roughly parallel to the 95th meridian from Minnesota to Texas. This line of posts formed a clear boundary, separating the designated Indian Territory from the encroaching white settlements. A typical post was Fort Scott, established in what would become eastern Kansas. In 1842, Companies A and C of the 1st and 2nd Dragoons arrived on site. With the help of only a handful of skilled artisans and using local resources, the soldiers themselves became builders. Their first duty was to construct the very fort they would occupy. It was a laborious task that took 4 years to complete, at a remarkably low cost of just $32,000. Like most military posts on the western frontier, Fort Scott was not a fortress enclosed by high walls. It resembled a self-sufficient village more than a traditional fort. A large parade ground formed the nucleus, with the American flag flying at its center. Ringing the grounds were the essential buildings of military life: officers' quarters, barracks for the cavalry and infantry, stables for the horses, a guardhouse, a blacksmith shop, a bakery, and the quartermaster building, which stored weapons, ammunition, and all other vital supplies. A dragoon regiment was divided into 10 companies, each containing about 75 officers and men. It was from these newly built outposts that the dragoons began their mission. One of their first major duties came in May of 1834. Colonel Henry Dodge led 8 companies of the 1st Dragoons deep into Indian Territory. His mission was to escort a wagon train along the Santa Fe Trail to Mexican territory. During the expedition, he successfully recovered a white captive and, more significantly, conducted the first major conference with the Comanche and Kiowa tribes, who until then had been almost completely unknown to the U.S. government. This initial contact was a fragile first step in a relationship that would define the West for decades to come. He didn't know it yet, but this move would trigger the bloodiest chapter of the day. One of the men who shaped this era was Stephen Watts Kearny. Born in 1794, Kearny began his military career as a young lieutenant in the War of 1812. He was a strong proponent of manifest destiny, seeing it as America's duty to expand westward, and he dedicated his life to leading that movement as both an explorer and a soldier. By the spring of 1845, he was ready to provide an impressive display of dragoon power to the Plains tribes. He gathered 5 companies, including one from Fort Scott, and prepared for a march of unprecedented scale. In May, Kearny led his dragoons from Fort Leavenworth in eastern Kansas, marching northwest to the Platte River and then proceeding west toward Fort Laramie. All along the way, his primary mission was to show the flag to the native tribes. This was not a mission of conquest, but of psychological warfare. At a parley with the Pawnee, Kearny requested that they make peace with their traditional enemies, the Sioux. When the Pawnee chiefs refused, Kearny gave an order. The dragoons fired their mountain howitzers. The thunderous roar of the cannons and the explosive impact of the shells so impressed the Pawnee that the tribe remained peaceful for the next 4 years. Next, it was the Sioux's turn. At Fort Laramie, the dragoons once more demonstrated their firepower. The Sioux watched, awed by the display. They concluded that these dragoons were a new and superior kind of white people and agreed to leave the immigrant traffic on the trails alone, provided the immigrants behaved themselves. From Fort Laramie, Kearny pushed his men even further west, traveling the Oregon Trail as far as South Pass in modern Wyoming. It was a landmark moment. For the first time in its history, the U.S. military had crossed the Continental Divide. He then marched his troops south to Bent's Fort, a famous trading post in southeastern Colorado. Founded in 1833 by William and Charles Bent, it was the single most important white trading post on the Santa Fe Trail between Missouri and the Mexican settlements. There, Kearny held a council with the Southern Cheyenne. Just as he had with the Pawnee and Sioux, his display of military strength made a deep impression. The Cheyenne chiefs, seeing the power of the United States military firsthand, began to fear for the future of their people. Kearny's long march was a resounding success. In 99 days, his men had covered 2,200 miles through the vast, semi-arid prairie. He proved that mounted U.S. troops could move with speed and ease across the plains, an ability that would be crucial in the years to come. Just 1 year after this expedition, Kearny took his beloved dragoons into the Mexican-American War, where his leadership was instrumental in winning New Mexico and California for the United States. He briefly served as the military governor of both territories, but his storied career came to a tragic end in 1848 when he died from yellow fever contracted during the war. A year after his death, gold was discovered in California, an event that would signal the true beginning of the Indian Wars. The dragoons he had molded continued to serve, but their designation would soon change. In 1861, the dragoon name disappeared. The 1st and 2nd Dragoons were officially renamed the 1st and 2nd Cavalry, while the Mounted Rifles became the 3rd Cavalry. All the units adopted the blue uniform with yellow trim, the iconic colors that would become synonymous with the wars on the plains. The Mexican-American War was a turning point. For the first time since George Washington's starving army shivered through the winter at Valley Forge, the the United States government created a large-scale professional army. Now, with the war over, America was a continental nation, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And it was the land along the Pacific coast where Americans wanted to go. They dreamed of the gold fields near San Francisco and the fertile farming valleys of Oregon. In a massive push west, hundreds of thousands of miners and settlers would have to traverse Indian country along the many overland trails. The year 1850 alone saw 50,000 immigrants travel the Oregon Trail, crossing a vast land that was home to over 200,000 Plains Indians. Washington believed it had a duty to protect its traveling citizens. As a result, Congress authorized the War Department to construct a string of forts and outposts along these trails. By 1854, it had built over 50 garrisons. However, in a move that was typical of Washington's approach to the coming wars, it sorely undermanned them. A mere 7,800 soldiers were tasked with manning this sprawling network of forts and policing a territory of immense size. The jewel of the northern system of forts was not built, but acquired. It was Fort Laramie in eastern Wyoming. The fort had started out as a humble trading post for trappers and Indians. In 1849, the Army's Adjutant General, Roger Jones, directed that a post be established at or near the location. Rather than build a new fort from scratch, the Army simply purchased the existing trading post from an agent of the American Fur Company for $4,000. Immediately, soldiers began refitting the old post for military use. By winter, new officers' quarters, soldiers' quarters, a bakery, and stables had been completed. With that, Fort Laramie began its 40-year role as a command post deep in the heart of Indian Territory. It quickly became the most famous, and some would say the most infamous, post on the western frontier. For the over 350,000 travelers on the Oregon and Mormon trails, it was the lone beacon of civilization in the vast emptiness between the east and west coasts. Since its founding as a trading post in 1834, the list of those who entered its storied gates read like a who's who of the Old West. Famous trappers and mountain men like James Beckwourth, Thomas Fitzpatrick, Jim Bridger, and Kit Carson all passed through. The ill-fated Donner Party stopped there in 1846 before their tragic journey into the Sierra Nevada. Brigham Young passed through while leading his Mormons to their new home in Utah. Top military commanders who would later define an era, men like William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip Sheridan, and George Crook, all knew the fort well. Many of the famous chiefs of the Northern Plains also spent time at the fort, alongside a cast of colorful Western characters whose legends would outlive them. Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, and Wyatt Earp. But less famous, though perhaps more important, were the troopers who manned the fort on a daily basis. Over its active 40-year history, units from nearly every cavalry and infantry regiment that fought in the Indian Wars served at Fort Laramie. In 1849, it was the mounted riflemen and infantry soldiers who rode out from its gates. Their mission was to maintain the Oregon Trail. Patrols escorted travelers, providing protection against the Native Americans, who were often just curious, many having rarely, if ever, seen a white man. The mounted riflemen were a unique, short-lived regiment, lasting a mere 15 years. They rode horses to their destination, then dismounted to fight from the ground with their rifles. These distinctive soldiers served at Fort Laramie until the Civil War, when their regiment was redesignated the 3rd Cavalry. The primary tool for negotiating with native tribes, ever since the Dutch acquired Manhattan in 1624, had been the peace treaty. Now, with a flood of white migration, a new treaty was needed to prevent the plains from erupting into violence. The key figure in what would be called the Laramie Treaty was the legendary mountain man Thomas Fitzpatrick. Known among the Indians as Broken Hand, he was a man the Plains tribes knew and trusted. The old mountain man saw the growing tension and knew that if something were not done, the Indians would rise up against the ever-increasing number of travelers on the Oregon Trail. In 1849, Fitzpatrick sent word to Washington, requesting that a peace conference be called at Fort Laramie. Early in 1851, Congress appropriated $100,000 for such a purpose. Once the snows were off the plains in the spring of that year, Fitzpatrick sent out trappers, mountain men, and friendly Indians from the fort to invite all the plains tribes to a peace conference. Everyone waited throughout the summer, uncertain if the tribes would respond. Then, in September, clouds of dust obscured the horizon. Fitzpatrick and the government representatives were awed by the arrival of more than 10,000 Indians from the northern plains. Hereditary enemies like the Cheyenne and Shoshone, the Sioux and the Crow, all came. The Fort Laramie Council was the largest gathering of its kind ever seen on the plains. The fort's commander, Captain William Scott Ketchum, made a clever suggestion. Seeing the thousands of horses that accompanied the tribes, he recommended the council be moved 30 miles downstream to a better grazing area. And so, the Great Council took place at the confluence of Horse Creek and the Platte River, just east of the current Wyoming-Nebraska state line. It was a remarkable accomplishment. The treaty allowed the U.S. government to construct its series of forts along the Oregon Trail. In return, the Indians agreed not to attack the wagon trains, and the immigrants agreed not to settle in Indian territory. The military was allowed to patrol the trails, providing some semblance of law and order, and both sides agreed to punish their own lawbreakers. For 3 years, a fragile peace held. Then, in the 18th of August 54, all hell broke loose. An impetuous young officer, Lieutenant John Grattan, took a patrol of 29 men from Fort Laramie. His objective was to march to a nearby Lakota Sioux village and arrest a warrior named High Forehead, who had allegedly stolen and butchered a Mormon's cow. When Grattan and his men arrived at the village, the Sioux refused to turn over the guilty party. After a brief tense parley, the soldiers unexpectedly opened fire on the camp, killing its chief. The Sioux camp retaliated instantly. Warriors swarmed Grattan's small detachment, massacring every member of the patrol. In an instant, the carefully crafted peace of the 1851 Laramie Treaty was shattered, and the plains were engulfed in war. In that moment, the Indian Wars unofficially began. For the next 35 years, Fort Laramie would play a prominent role in the bloody conflict between the U.S. military and the Indian tribes of the northern plains. While the northern tribes had fewer encounters with whites before the 1850s, the southern Indians had a long and violent history of conflict with Europeans. The Kiowa, Comanche, Navajo, and Apache had repeatedly defeated the Spanish, who were ill-prepared to rule the harsh southern plains. Later, they regularly raided Mexican and Texan settlements. Now that their lands had officially become part of the United States, the War Department was pressed to end the Indian threat to the Santa Fe Trail, a vital commercial artery. This required the building of even more forts. One of the most prominent forts along the Santa Fe Trail was Fort Larned. It was significant for the multiple roles it played: a military post, a refuge for travelers, a critical supply point, and a distribution center for Indian annuities. These annuities, which were promised to the various tribes in peace treaties, were essentially a kind of bribe intended to keep the peace. They typically consisted of basic goods like flour, coffee, and sugar, as well as trade items such as cloth and beads. They also included agricultural implements, which were meant to teach the Plains Indians farming and discourage their nomadic lifestyle. In a move that would have deadly consequences, the annuities often included arms and ammunition. This policy created its own set of problems. At designated times, hundreds of heavily armed Native American warriors would descend on the post to collect their goods. They often arrived dressed in their finest regalia, with faces painted for ceremony and long war headdresses of eagle feathers. The soldiers garrisoning the fort understood the tension of these moments perfectly. They knew if the Indians went away unhappy, their anger might erupt into raids and even warfare. Sometimes the goods and food were of shoddy quality. Even worse, sometimes they hadn't arrived at all. At these moments, tension ran high. The risk of an explosion of violence was immense. In fact, in 1860, Fort Larned was known as Camp Alert because the constant danger of Indian attacks kept the soldiers on a knife edge, waiting for a battle that could begin at any second. When word of a raid reached Fort Larned, the commander's response was to send out a patrol. A small patrol usually consisted of 10 to 20 privates, led by a lieutenant and a sergeant. They would ride out from the fort to hunt for the perpetrators, a difficult and often fruitless task. Each trooper was a self-contained unit, equipped to survive for days on the open plains. He rode a McClellan saddle, and attached to it was a nose bag holding a day or two of grain for his horse. He carried a picket pin and a long rope so he could stake his horse out at night to graze. If the ground was too hard, he had chains and hobbles. Packed inside his gear was a shelter half. His partner on the patrol carried the other half, and together they could make a small tent. He had a blanket, a poncho for rain, and perhaps a change of clothes. His saddlebags contained his rations, bacon, hardtack biscuits, and maybe a couple cans of sardines if he had spent his own money at the sutler's store. His weapons were the tools of his trade. The carbine was a Springfield model 45 to 70, a shorter, lighter rifle ideal for use on horseback. For close fighting, he carried a Colt model 1873 Army revolver, a powerful .45 caliber pistol. The horses they rode were typically strong, sturdy animals, bred for endurance. Many enthusiastic troopers also carried personal weapons, such as extra pistols and large knives, when on patrol. Finding the raiding parties was the hardest part of the mission. Because the Indians roamed freely across the vast prairie, the army had immense difficulty locating them. To solve this, they relied on mountain men and trappers who served as scouts. These intrepid men had learned the Indians' habits and customs. They often knew the area as well as the warriors they hunted, and their skill at tracking was indispensable. While the cavalry patrolled the trails, the infantry formed the backbone of the garrisons. Wearing uniforms marked by red stripes, infantry soldiers did not carry swords but were equipped with bayonets. Their standard rifles, usually a .58 caliber muzzle-loading musket, were longer ranged than the cavalry's carbines and could lay down a more effective field of killing fire. For years, these men, both mounted and on foot, were the face of the U.S. military on the frontier. Then, in 1861, everything changed. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the long-neglected military took center stage. Everything about the armed forces was overhauled. Training, weapons, leadership, and strategies, all were vastly improved. The brutal crucible of the war forged a new, more effective fighting machine. At first, the western garrisons suffered from this shift in focus. At Fort Larned, most of the professional soldiers were replaced by volunteer units, as the regulars were sent east to fight the Confederacy. But when Indian raids threatened the critical supplies being carried along the Santa Fe Trail, the Union sent 2 companies of cavalry to Fort Larned, and the trail once more became quiet. This peace was temporary. In 1864, a much-anticipated Indian uprising swept the prairie. Trade along the trail was paralyzed that summer and fall. As a result, the military's approach changed. Larger, more punitive expeditions were sent out from Fort Larned and the nearby Fort Lyon. The U.S. military was about to begin a new phase of Indian fighting on the plains. It would employ different tactics, a scorched-earth strategy that had been perfected by men like Kit Carson during the Army's campaign against the Navajo. It was also a time when forts such as Larned transitioned from havens for travelers to hardened battle stations and supply centers for the new, extended field campaigns that would define the next stage of the war. One of the pivotal commanders in this new era was Christopher Kit Carson. Born in 1809, he became one of America's greatest frontier heroes, a man in the mold of Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. Known as rope thrower to the Indians, he left home at 16 and started trapping, eventually becoming a legendary mountain man. His explorations led him the length of the Rocky Mountains and into California, a time when few men survived the rugged travel through the mountains and deserts of the West. Carson, however, had learned the ways of the Indians. By the time he was 40, his exploits were the tales told in the salons of eastern cities. He was an unusual man among the rough community of mountain men. According to fellow trappers, Carson was clean as a hound's tooth, and a man whose word was as sure as the sun coming up. His relationship with the tribes was complex, built on years of shared experience. But he was also a man of the army. After the Mexican-American War, the Navajo, a warrior culture that occupied the canyon lands of present-day New Mexico and Arizona, were in constant conflict with the United States military. They had become a horse society even before the famous nomadic tribes exploded onto the plains. In 1860, the Navajo chiefs Manuelito and Barbanchito gathered 1,000 warriors and attacked Fort Defiance. The fighting was hand-to-hand, and the Navajo very nearly succeeded in capturing the post. When the dust settled, the army decided that it had to make an example of the Navajo to teach the desert Indians that they could not attack American soldiers with impunity. The man tasked with this was General James Carleton. Determined to subdue the Navajo and complete what the army could not do before the Civil War, Carleton sought the help of Kit Carson, who had been appointed a colonel in the 1st New Mexico Infantry. Carson was a longtime friend of the Navajo. He understood them because he had wintered with them, fought with them, and hunted with them. When Manuelito and other chiefs spurned his initial offers of peace, Carson knew that the old ways of fighting would not work. He knew the only path to victory was to destroy their farms and villages. There would be no more peace treaties, no more simple retaliatory patrols. Instead, the new strategy was to search the Navajo out and destroy their ability to live. And so Carson, the one-time ally of the Navajo, began his scorched earth policy. His men swept through their lands, destroying their fields, their crops, their livestock, and their precious orchards. The campaign was relentless and brutal. Within only a few months, the strategy proved devastatingly effective. The Navajo, starving and dressed in rags, had no choice but to surrender. They were then forced on the infamous Long Walk, removed from their homeland, and sent to the Bosque Redondo Reservation on the Pecos River, broken by a new kind of total war. After the Civil War, an event in northern Wyoming would turn public opinion firmly against the Native Americans on the plains and usher in a new, more brutal chapter of the conflict. In 1866, a war party of Sioux, led by the brilliant warrior High Backbone, executed a perfect ambush. They lured a cavalry patrol of 80 men out of Fort Phil Kearny. The patrol's commander, Captain William J. Fetterman, was a man full of bravado who had once boasted that with 80 men he could ride through the entire Sioux nation. On that December day, his arrogance met a grim reality. The Sioux sprung their trap, and in a furious, desperate fight, Fetterman and all 80 of his men were killed. The battle was followed by acts of scalping and mutilation. When news of the Fetterman massacre reached the East, Americans were shocked and outraged. They demanded that something be done. For the white settlers on the frontier, one of the most disturbing facets of the Indian Wars was the tactic of random raiding. Rather than attacking the specific people who had actually injured them, warriors often took out their anger by raiding any available homesteads, wagon trains, or military patrols. Innocent settlers and travelers were terrified by the constant threat of their families being tortured and mutilated. The Fetterman disaster was the final straw. The military leadership realized that their old strategies were failing. They needed to eliminate the threat at its source. A new philosophy of war began to take hold, one that Kit Carson had so successfully used against the Navajo in the mid-1860s. The plan was simple and ruthless. Find the Indian villages and destroy them. Capture or kill their ponies, the foundation of their nomadic life, and exterminate their primary food source, the great herds of buffalo. To implement this new strategy, the government put 2 hardened Civil War veterans in charge of the operation. These men would develop a strategy of total war designed to eliminate the Indian problem once and for all. They were General Philip Sheridan and General William Tecumseh Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman was one of the most celebrated generals of the Civil War and a man of military vision. In 1864, he had been the first to apply the concept of total war to the rebellious southern states. Born in Lancaster, Ohio, in 1820, he graduated from West Point 6th in his class. Like many Union generals, Sherman had participated in the Mexican-American War and then rose to his highest distinction fighting the Confederates. He understood that destroying an enemy's will to fight meant destroying their ability to sustain themselves. Philip Sheridan had also grown up in Ohio, though he was born in Albany, New York, in 1831. He attended West Point and graduated near the bottom of his class in 1853. But in the crucible of war, Sheridan rose from obscurity to lead the Union's cavalry. By the war's end, his campaign in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia had smashed the South's most important agricultural region and helped bring about the Confederate surrender. He was a man who understood how to use cavalry to destroy an enemy's resources. Now, Sherman brought his strategy of total war to the plains, and Sheridan refined it for this new environment. Their shared philosophy for fighting Indians was summed up by Sherman, and it was brutally simple. All Indians who are not on reservations are hostile and will remain so until killed off. Successfully implementing this search and destroy strategy required that the army execute extensive campaigns, with large military forces operating far away from their forts for weeks or even months at a time. This new professional army needed professional soldiers. On the 1st of July, 1867, new soldiers arrived at Fort Davis, Texas, but they were not soldiers of the usual sort. They were black men, members of a new regiment whose men would soon become known as the Buffalo Soldiers. In 1866, the Army had increased the number of cavalry regiments from 6 to 10, a force that included 2 black units, the 9th and 10th Cavalry. They were called Buffalo Soldiers by the Indians, a name given because of the dark coats they wore and their short, curly hair, which resembled the mane of a buffalo. The black troopers epitomized America's new professional army. They were made up of battle-hardened veterans of the Civil War. Disciplined and tough, the 9th and 10th fought in 127 confirmed battles with Indians. The 9th Cavalry fought mostly in the Southwest until 1881, after which its units went to Kansas and Washington State. The 10th Cavalry served with General Sheridan and was commanded by Colonel Benjamin Grierson, who led the regiment from 1866 to 1890 on the southern plains of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. These units became some of the most effective and respected fighting forces on the frontier. Their service continued for decades, until the outset of World War II, when the 9th and 10th Cavalry were finally disbanded and their units absorbed into the larger army. They were the men on the front lines, tasked with carrying out the new, unyielding strategy of total war. Nothing has fueled the emotions and imagination more than the massacres committed by both sides during the Indian Wars in the second half of the 19th century. However, these brutal events were not the beginning of the story. They were only the final chapter in a bitter 250-year struggle that had its roots in the first colonial settlements along the eastern seaboard. Before that time, three important groups controlled the region east of the Appalachian Mountains. First, the Iroquois League held the balance of power in eastern North America until the end of the 18th century. Next, the Powhatan Confederacy held power over the Middle and South Atlantic coast, including present-day Virginia and the Carolinas. The largest group, the Algonquian-speaking tribes, lived both east and west of the Appalachians and dominated the Great Lakes region. Further to the south and west were other nations, like the Alabama, Caddo, and Tunica. Many of these tribes initially helped the colonists to thrive in the harsh conditions of North America, a relationship often symbolized by the first Thanksgiving in 1621 at Plymouth, Massachusetts. After that, the relationship between the colonists and the Indians soon turned confrontational. At first, these hostilities took the form of small skirmishes along the frontier, but they soon evolved into full-scale wars. The first of these was the Pequot War in 1637, fought in Connecticut and Rhode Island. It established the pattern for subsequent Native American warfare for the next 2 centuries. When the Pequot refused to give up the Indians who had murdered a white trader, the Puritans retaliated. They attacked the principal Pequot settlement, burned the village to the ground, and slaughtered over 500 of its inhabitants. The surviving Pequot were relentlessly pursued until they were killed or driven out of the area completely. 40 years later, this brutal strategy was used again in King Philip's War. From 1675 to 1676, the conflict raged across New England. King Philip was the name the Puritans had given to a Wampanoag chief named Metacom. Though his people were generally peaceful, Metacom resented the constant white intrusions into their territory. In 1675, he led his tribe against the colonies of Plymouth, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Indian raiding parties burned several New England towns, and they killed and captured hundreds of colonists. They almost succeeded in driving the Europeans out of New England completely. But in the end, colonial soldiers ended the threat by destroying the Indian villages and killing King Philip himself. The destructiveness of the war was immense. Perhaps 1,000 colonists lost their lives. The percentage of loss as compared to the total population made Philip's War the most devastating conflict in American history. It was in the ashes of this war that the idea that the only good Indian is a dead Indian was first born, long before it was attributed to General Phil Sheridan nearly 200 years later. Far to the southwest, a different kind of conflict was brewing. Spanish priests and settlers had pushed into the desert occupied by the Navajo, Apache, and Pueblo peoples. After conquering the Pueblos, the Spanish tried to enslave them and convert them to Christianity. This worked for the better part of the 17th century, until 1680. That year, a charismatic medicine man named Pope led the Pueblos in a revolt against their Spanish overlords. They slaughtered 400 missionaries and settlers and forced the remaining colonists and their families to flee south to Mexico. It was this rebellion that released the Spanish horse onto the plains. These horses went on to make up the wild Mustang herds that formed the nucleus of the nomadic Plains Indian warrior horse culture. In 1689, the Spanish came back in force and put down the rebellion, retaking Santa Fe in 1692. But the genie had been released from the bottle. The nomadic warrior culture was already underway. The great European conflicts also spilled over into the New World. Dramatized in James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, The French and Indian War saw the native tribes fight on both sides of the 7-year conflict between the French and the British. The Iroquois joined the British, and the Algonquin Indians fought on the side of the French. When the British were victorious, the tribes who had sided with the French were dismayed at losing their ancestral lands. Several Native American nations, under the leadership of the great Ottawa chief Pontiac, continued to fight. The ferocity and swiftness of the Indians' attacks during Pontiac's war nearly succeeded in forcing the British out of the territory west of the Appalachians. It was the greatest stand by Native Americans until the Plains Indians Wars 100 years later. Even after the American Revolution, the conflicts continued. The Miami and Shawnee, under the war chief Little Turtle, tried to halt the onslaught of settlers streaming into the old Northwest Territory of Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. They were nearly successful. In the 17th of October 91, Little Turtle's forces attacked General Arthur St. Clair on the Ohio-Indiana border. St. Clair lost more than 800 of his 1,400 men. It was the greatest defeat ever suffered by an American military force, a loss that more than tripled Custer's casualties at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. However, at the Battle of the Fallen Timbers in 1794, General Mad Anthony Wayne's well-disciplined troops dealt the Indians a crushing defeat, forcing them to cede lands to the new United States government. 15 years later, the celebrated Shawnee war chief Tecumseh and his brother, known as the Prophet, tried to organize a grand alliance of Indian nations throughout the Ohio River Valley to fight westward migration. But at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, General William Henry Harrison led a group of militia who destroyed any chance of Tecumseh's Confederation succeeding. Impressed by Tecumseh's oratory, a part-white warrior named William Weatherford, known as Red Eagle, led his Creek warriors against Fort Mims on the Alabama River in the 18th of August 13. The fort's small group of militia fought until all were killed, and the Creeks then massacred all but about 36 of the 500 settlers who had taken refuge there. In 1814, General Andrew Jackson smashed Southern Indian resistance at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. 3 years later, he took on the Seminoles in the First Seminole War and chased them out of South Georgia and northern Florida. But the Seminoles would rise up against white settlers twice more, from 1835 to 1842, and again from 1855 to 1858. Both times they were defeated by American military forces. One of the last skirmishes east of the Mississippi River was the Black Hawk War. In 1832, a Sauk Indian leader named Black Hawk opposed giving Indian lands to whites. For 4 months, he led his band in a fight against American militia, until his followers were virtually wiped out at the Bad Axe River. By the 1850s, the Indian nations east of the Mississippi River had lost their final battles with the U.S. government. However, from the time of the Pueblo Uprising to the middle of the 19th century, a new kind of native culture had developed on the continent. For the first time, Americans were about to be confronted by a true warrior culture. These were the 7 warrior Indian nations, the Navajo, the Apache, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Sioux, that had migrated into the country's interior. True warrior cultures have been rare during Earth's history. For the one that arose on the American Central Plains, the greatest honor was not to kill, but to count coup, or to touch an enemy in battle and live. Those warriors who acquired this distinction were held in the highest regard by their people. It was a culture forged in generations of conflict, and it was about to face its greatest test. From the moment of birth, a young boy in a Plains Indian tribe was steeped in a culture of war. This was not a choice, but a necessity for survival in a harsh and competitive world. All boys, whether they grew up to become warriors, hunters, scouts, or shamans, learned the arts of war from their earliest days. In fact, The way of the warrior started even before birth. From the moment a woman became pregnant, she prepared her child for survival by making protective amulets, often in the shape of a lizard or a turtle. Once a son was born, his father would make small toy weapons for him to play with. When the child was old enough to stand, he was given his first bow. Growing up, boys played games that constantly tested and honed their skills with weapons. In one game, the hoop game, young boys would shoot their arrows at a rolling hoop of wood, learning to lead a moving target. Once a boy was old enough, his father gave him a colt and instructed him on how to ride and care for it. The horse and the warrior would become a single fighting unit, and this bond began in childhood. Around puberty, advanced warrior training began. The physical demands were intense. Boys ran and swam for endurance. They threw lances and shot arrows for skill. They learned the art of making their own weapons, a craft passed down through generations. Finally, they had to master the most difficult skill of all, shooting arrows from any position, even while riding a horse at a full gallop, leaning under its neck to use the animal as a shield. Survival was as important as combat. Often, a young warrior was left alone on the prairie for a period of time. There, he learned to fend for himself. He had to learn to know every animal track, how to find water where there was none, and how to spot an enemy's trail. He learned to read the subtle signs of the land, to know what his enemies were carrying and where they were going just from the tracks they left behind. Once these skills of riding, using weapons, survival, and tracking were conquered, the young warrior had to master the art of war itself. He did this by accompanying older warriors on raids for horses or perhaps even in battle. The kind of warfare he was learning would, in today's language, be called guerrilla warfare. It especially included the art of the ambush. A warrior's life followed a clear path. In his teens, he would be given more responsibilities, such as protecting the tribe's vital horse herds. At age 15 or so, a promising warrior candidate might be invited to join a warrior society. By 17, he might have stolen his first horse from an enemy camp or taken his first scalp. At 19, he would undergo the rigors of his first Sunday dance ceremony. By his mid-20s, he would be ready to lead his first war party. Finally, at age 30, with his young blood days behind him, he would begin to withdraw from his active warrior status and give himself over to the hunt, making way for the next generation. The most frequent purpose of a raid was to get more horses, the primary measure of wealth and status on the plains. A raid was usually prompted by a dream that guided a warrior to action. Sitting Bull, for example, famously used his dreams to predict the defeat of Custer. The leader of the raiding party was known as the pipe holder, and he was generally well acquainted with the landmarks and watering holes of the enemy territory. These raiders were scrupulous about following their dreams to the letter. If something was not right, or if a bad omen was seen, the raid would be called off. For the Kiowa, hearing the hoot of an owl was a terrible omen, and they would immediately turn back. A simple raiding party consisted of 4 to 20 warriors. War parties were much larger and could number in the hundreds. Raiders would be away from their camp anywhere from 2 weeks to several months. The typical raiding party traveled in single file, with the pipe leader in front, the more experienced warriors next, and the youngest neophytes last. Often, scouts would ride far ahead to make certain the way was clear before an attack or ambush. When it was time for battle, the warriors prepared themselves by donning their sacred headdresses and painting their faces. Their individualized attack strategy, an ethos that worked well against fellow Indian nations, would ultimately fail them in their later conflicts with the disciplined United States military. While a war party approached a camp as a unit, once a battle commenced, any thought of cooperation flew away. Every warrior fought for individual honors and the chance to count coup. On these raids, a warrior would carry a full complement of weapons. The weapon of choice for the Plains Indian warrior was the bow and arrow. They made two types of bows, a self-bow, fashioned from a single piece of wood, and a composite bow, manufactured from layers of wood, bone, or horn that were glued and lashed together with sinew. Warriors also made composite recurve bows that were so powerful they could send an arrow completely through a buffalo. Bowstrings were made from sinew or rawhide strips. Most bows were from 3 to 3.5 feet in length and took at least a month to make. A warrior often carried 2 or more bows with him. The arrows they used measured on average 25.5 inches in length, and each arrow bore the owner's distinctive marks so that his deeds in battle could be known. The arrowheads were the most intriguing part. Most Indians in the Plains Wars did not use traditional stone points. Instead, the Plains warrior used iron tips, obtained from the whites in trade or raids. When a wagon train was captured or a farmstead raided, the iron bands from barrels were taken as prime loot, because a single band could yield up to 20 arrowheads. The bows and arrows were carried in a quiver, which, like all of a warrior's belongings, was usually highly decorated with beads, quills, and animal skins. However, the arsenal of the Plains warrior was not limited to bows and arrows. From an early age, warriors were taught to fight with a variety of weapons, including lances, knives, clubs, and hatchets. All of these weapons were usually highly decorated with eagle feathers, animal skins, or quills. The knife was the most versatile weapon a warrior had, and could be used in a variety of tasks, from hunting and food preparation to killing an enemy. The war club was used for close-in fighting. After the horse was adopted, the handles of these clubs became longer, so a warrior could strike down at an enemy while on horseback. The famous tomahawk was made from iron. Finally, as early as the mid-17th century, Indians had obtained muskets through trading or raiding. By the time the Plains Indian culture arose, rifles were part of every trading company's stock, and just prior to the Indian Wars, every Indian nation possessed firearms. Still, even with these new weapons, the warrior on horseback with his bow and arrows was the Earth's most effective fighting machine at that time. It was ironic that the event which had the greatest influence in shaping white sentiment against the Plains Indians took place far from the high plains in the woodlands of Minnesota, and it was carried out by the Santee Sioux, the last of the great Siouan groups to adopt the horse. Their use of the animal was different from their nomadic cousins to the west. Much like the US mounted rifle companies, the Santee often used their horses for transportation, dismounting to engage in battle on foot. They were a woodland people who had been pushed steadily west, finally confined to reservations along the Minnesota River. The conflict that erupted there in 1862 would become known as the Minnesota Massacre or the Sioux Uprising. In its bloody wake, more white settlers were killed than in any other Indian war conflict west of the Mississippi River. It began, as these conflicts so often did, with a small, seemingly isolated incident that spun rapidly out of control. On the 17th of August, 1862, 4 young Santee hunters were near a farm settlement in Acton, Minnesota. An argument over a nest of eggs on a white farmer's land escalated. Words turned to threats, and threats turned to sudden violence. The hunters attacked the family, killing the father, the mother, and a daughter. The spark had been lit. When the young men returned to their village and told what they had done, the decision was made to continue the fight. For the next month, the Santee Sioux rampaged against the settlements. They swept through the Minnesota River Valley, descending on unprepared farms and small towns. They killed 644 whites and captured nearly 300 men, women, and children. The Santee chief, Little Crow, now found himself in an impossible position. He understood the power of the United States and knew that the Santee had little chance of winning a prolonged war against them. But his warriors were committed to the fight, and he was their leader. In a council with his men, he laid out the grim reality, but concluded with a declaration of his loyalty to his people. "Little Crow is not a coward," he told them. "He will die with you." With that, he declared that the war had begun. News of the uprising reached the nearby army post of Fort Ridgely. The commander, Captain John Marsh, was suspicious that the reports were exaggerated, a common issue on the frontier where panic could spread faster than facts. Nonetheless, he felt it was necessary for him to investigate. He marched from the fort with a force of 46 men and one interpreter, heading for the Lower Sioux Agency. When he reached the Redwood Ferry, which crossed the Minnesota River, his small force was walking directly into a trap. Indians were concealed in the thick brush along both sides of the river, waiting. The ambush was sudden and devastating. A volley of gunfire erupted from the trees, tearing through the ranks of the soldiers. The fight that followed was a desperate, chaotic struggle for survival. Marsh's men were caught completely exposed. Approximately half of his command were killed in the ambush. Captain Marsh himself drowned in the river while trying to lead his surviving men to safety. The shattered remainder of his force managed to fight their way free and struggled to return to the relative safety of Fort Ridgely. In the course of the uprising, the Sioux mostly attacked undefended farms and small settlements where they had the advantage. But in 2 instances, emboldened by their initial successes, they attacked a large town and the army post itself. They launched assaults on the settlement of New Ulm and on Fort Ridgely, but in both cases the defenders managed to hold them off. By the beginning of September, the tide of the battle had begun to swing against the Sioux. The final major engagement took place at Wood Lake, Minnesota, in late September. Colonel Henry Sibley, who had been appointed military commander of the region by the governor of Minnesota, marched up the river valley with a formidable force of approximately 1,600 men. His army was composed mainly of volunteer regiments of Minnesota infantry that had been recalled from Civil War duty in the East. On the 23rd of the 18th of September 62, Sibley's force encountered Little Crow and his warriors, who numbered perhaps as many as 1,000. In the ensuing Battle of Wood Lake, the Indians were decisively defeated by the superior numbers and firepower of the U.S. troops. After the defeat, Little Crow released his 269 women and children captives. Of the 2,000 warriors who eventually surrendered, 393 were put on trial by a military commission. 303 were swiftly condemned to death by hanging. The sentences were sent to Washington for review. President Abraham Lincoln, embroiled in the midst of the Civil War, personally investigated the trial records and the causes of the uprising. He concluded that many of the convicted had been engaged in battle but had not committed atrocities against civilians. He approved the death sentences for only 39 of the 303 convicted Indians. One was later given a reprieve. The remaining 38 warriors were hung simultaneously on a single massive gallows in Mankato, Minnesota, on the 26th of December, 1862. It was, and remains, the largest mass execution in United States history. In the years that followed, further military campaigns in 1863 and 1864 continued to pursue the remaining Santee, pushing them out of Minnesota and into the vast Dakota Territory. 2 years later, another fire would ignite on the southern plains, leading to one of an equally infamous massacre. Sometime around 1740, the Cheyenne Nation had migrated onto the plains along the Missouri River. While still living as traditional woodland Indians, they had been preyed upon for decades by other tribes and nearly driven to extinction. That changed with the Great Horse Dispersal at the beginning of the century. Practically overnight, the Cheyenne transformed themselves. They became skilled horsemen, now capable of handling their former enemies, the Sioux and the Crow. On the plains, the Cheyenne prospered, and their numbers grew dramatically. Militarily, their strength also grew, first through an alliance with the Arapaho and later with the powerful Sioux. In the early 19th century, the Cheyenne had become so successful that they were raiding the large Comanche horse herds south of the Arkansas River. During these raids, many of the Cheyenne fell in love with the region of Kansas and Colorado. It was a land resplendent with tall grass prairie and teeming with buffalo. By 1825, over half of the Cheyenne Nation, joined by many Arapaho, had migrated into this buffalo-rich region permanently. The move was motivated by economics. The Cheyenne chief Yellow Wolf met with the Bent brothers, and together they created a highly lucrative trading partnership centered at Bent's Fort on the Arkansas River. For a time, all seemed well between the Southern Cheyenne and the whites. So much so that several Cheyenne chiefs traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with American presidents. White Antelope and Alights on the Cloud met with President Fillmore in 1851. Another delegation, which included the chiefs War Bonnet, Standing in the Water, and Lean Bear, met with Abraham Lincoln during the height of the Civil War in the 18th of March 63, seeking to secure peace for their people. Oddly, soon after this second peace trip, widespread hostilities broke out among many Cheyenne and whites, even while other Cheyenne were attempting to adapt to the lifestyles of the whites. This paradox and confusion would lead to tragedy. After the Minnesota Massacre in 1862, fear of the Indians on the plains ran high among the white settlers in Colorado. This fear was brought home in a horrific way on the 11th of June, 1864. At a ranch on Boxelder Creek, the Hungate family was killed. Nathan Hungate, his wife Ellen, and their two young daughters, Laura, not yet 3, and Florence, not yet 5 months old, were all slain. Their mutilated bodies were brought into Denver and put on public display, fueling a wave of panic and outrage. These raids, along with the killing of 53 settlers on the Overland Trail in August, is what fueled the military expedition of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry under Colonel John Chivington. A month earlier, near Fort Laramie, Kansas, the Cheyenne chief Lean Bear, the same man who had just returned from his meeting with Lincoln, was gunned down by troopers as he approached them, showing the peace medal the president had given him. This unprovoked killing prompted retaliatory raids by the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers. In the 18th of June 64, Colorado's territorial governor, John Evans, issued a proclamation directing friendly Indians to appear at the various U.S. government forts to be registered and protected. 2 months later, the great Cheyenne peace chief, Black Kettle, requested a meeting with the commander of Fort Lyon, Major Edward Wynkoop. Wynkoop was highly impressed with Black Kettle, later writing that the chief sat dignified, immovable, with a slight smile on his face. A bond of mutual trust was formed between the two men. As a result, Black Kettle, White Antelope, and Bull Bear, one of the leaders of the Dog Soldiers, traveled to Denver to meet with Governor Evans and Colonel John M. Chivington for a council held at Camp Weld. Chivington, a former minister, was the military commander in Colorado Territory and the nominal head of the 3rd Colorado Regiment, a unit formed exclusively to hunt down Indians. At the meeting, Black Kettle spoke plainly. "All we ask is that we may have peace with the whites," he said. "You are our father. We've been traveling through a cloud. The sky has been dark ever since the war began." In return, Evans accused the Cheyenne of initiating hostilities and gave a chilling warning. "The time when you can make war best is in the summertime. When I can make war best is in the winter. You so far have had the advantage. My time is just coming." At the end of the conference, Chivington stated his own philosophy. "My rule of fighting white men or Indians is to fight them until they lay down their arms and submit to military authority." The conference ended without any firm commitment to peace from either side. Historians still dispute whether Black Kettle left believing that if he brought his people to Fort Lyon, they would be safe. Regardless, in the 18th of November 64, Black Kettle and the Cheyenne began arriving near Fort Lyon. By this time, Wynkoop had been relieved of his command for being too soft on the Indians. The new commander, Major Scott Anthony, directed Black Kettle and his band to camp about 40 miles to the northeast on a bend of the Big Sandy, also known as Sand Creek. Meanwhile, Colonel Chivington had other plans. In mid-November, he left Denver with his troops and headed down the Arkansas River to Fort Lyon, which he reached on the night of the 28th of November. Now in command of 700 troops, armed with short-barreled carbines and pistols, and supported by 4 12-pound mountain howitzers, Chivington ordered his cavalry to march on Black Kettle's encampment. There were probably 115 to 120 teepees there, with maybe 500 men, women, and children. Chivington approached from the south. He dismounted his men, and they walked through the village. This initial move allowed many of the Indians to escape up the creek bed. When the soldiers got to the far end of the village, they saw the Indians fleeing. It was at that time that many of the officers lost control of their men. Almost on an individual basis, the soldiers started going after the fleeing Indians. They chased them up the creek for several miles. As they ran, the Indians dug into the sandy banks of the creek, creating homemade rifle pits to make defensive positions. The battle lasted from dawn until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a long, drawn-out affair. The soldiers took 76 casualties, 25 killed and 51 wounded. In the context of the Indian Wars, that was a significant fight. For the Cheyenne, it was devastating. They lost upwards of 150 people. But the thing that distinguished Sand Creek was what happened afterwards. After the battle, some of the men, no doubt angry over the summer of raids and the massacre of the Hungate family, took their vengeance. They scalped and mutilated many of the Cheyenne bodies. The soldiers saw this as a just victory. The Cheyenne, of course, viewed the event as a horrific massacre. Black Kettle survived the attack. But the massacre pushed the more moderate peace chiefs aside and elevated the warrior societies, especially the dog soldiers, to power. When news of the massacre reached the East, Americans were horrified. President Lincoln saw to it that Governor Evans was removed from office, and Chivington was investigated by Congress and forced to leave the military. But the damage was done. The Sand Creek Massacre had fanned the flames of hatred and guaranteed that the war between the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux and the United States would continue, becoming even more brutal and unforgiving. The events at Sand Creek and in Minnesota were just the beginning. The period following the Civil War would see the U.S. military, now a hardened and professional force, launch major campaigns across the West. It was an era that would give rise to legendary chiefs like Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse, and see some of the most iconic battles in American history fought on the high plains. In our next story, we'll cover this crucial period: the strategy to exterminate the bison, the desperate and brilliant resistance of the Plains tribes, and the final, tragic conflicts that ultimately led to the end of the Indian Wars.